Happy July 11th in our summer Sunday school series, Ordinary Sinners. Today we look at King Saul. Not Saul who became Paul, but King Saul from the Old Testament in the book of 1 Samuel. What we see about Saul is we kind of have to look to David as well, who's going to be our sinner next week on July 18th. But we see that Saul and David's stories are tied pretty close together, and the way that they respond to their sin is very different, and that makes a difference in whether they're a good example to follow or a bad example to follow. The story of King Saul kicks off in 1 Samuel chapter 8. At the first verse, we see the nation of Israel, God's people, and they're looking around and saying, all these other kingdoms around us have a king. We think we want one too. It says that 1 Samuel 8, verse 4, finally the elders of Israel met at Ramah to discuss the matter with Samuel. Look, they told him, you're old and your sons are not like you. Give us a king to judge us like all the other nations have. Samuel was displeased with their request and went to the Lord for guidance. Do everything they say to you, the Lord replied, for they are rejecting me, not you. They don't want me to be their king any longer. Ever since I brought them from Egypt, they have continually abandoned me, followed other gods, and now are giving you the same treatment. Do as they ask, but warn them about the way a king will rule over them. So Samuel passed on the Lord's warning to the people who were asking for a king. God's people thought they knew what was best. They looked around at everybody else and thought, well, everybody else has it figured out. Instead of following God's way, let's follow our way. Let's ask for a king. And God gives them what they wanted, but what they figure out is maybe what they wanted wasn't really what they needed. But they needed to trust God and follow him and make him number one, because by asking for a king, it brought some trouble upon them. We see that Saul is the first king that Israel has, and we see him do some pretty decent things to start with. And if you get a chance this week, you might want to look at the whole of 1 Samuel, starting at chapter 8 and going all the way through 18, maybe to get the whole picture of what Saul was like in his life. If you get a chance, maybe one chapter a day. But we're going to kind of pick up at 1 Samuel 15 here and see what happened. It says, one day Samuel said to Saul, it is the Lord who told me to anoint you king of his people Israel. Now listen to the message of the Lord. The Lord of heaven's armies has declared, I have decided to settle accounts with the nation of Amalek for opposing Israel when they came from Egypt. Go and completely destroy that nation, men, women, children, cattle, sheep, goats, and donkeys. So Saul mobilized his army. Then Saul and his army went down to the town of the Amalekites and lay in wait in the valley. Saul sent this warning, move away, Amalekites, or you will die with them. For you showed kindness to the people of Israel when they came up from Egypt. So the Canaanites packed up and left. Then Saul slaughtered the Amalekites from Havilah all the way to shore east of Egypt, captured Agag, the Amalekite king, but completely destroyed everything else. Saul and his men spared Agag's life and kept the best of the sheep and the cattle and the calves and lambs for themselves, and that appealed to them. They destroyed only what was worthless or of poor quality. And the Lord said to Samuel, I am very sorry that I ever made Saul king, for he has not been loyal to me, has refused to obey my commands. Samuel was deeply moved when he heard this and cried out to the Lord. So Saul, instead of listening and obeying God's instruction to wipe out everything, followed God's instruction just a little bit, but thought he knew better. Thought, oh, these things that are good, these cattle and riches that are good for me and good for others, that I'll take and keep. Didn't end up working out in his favor. So then Samuel has to go and tell Saul in this chapter what has happened. This is early that next morning. This is 1 Samuel 15:12. Samuel went to find Saul. Someone told him Saul went to the town of Carmel to set up a monument to himself. Then he went on to Gilgal. When Samuel finally found him, Saul greeted him cheerfully. "May the Lord bless you," he said. "I have carried out the Lord's command." "Then what is that bleating of sheep and goats and the lowing of cattle I hear?" Samuel demanded. "It's true, the army spared the best of the sheep and the goats," Saul admitted, "but they're going to sacrifice them to the Lord. We destroyed everything else." Then Samuel said, "Stop. Listen to what the Lord told me." "What did he tell you?" Saul asked. Samuel told him, "Although you may think little of yourselves, you are not the leader of are you not the leader of the tribes of Israel? The Lord has anointed you king of Israel. And the Lord sent you on a mission and told you, go and completely destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, until everything is gone and dead. Why haven't you obeyed the Lord? Why did you rush for the plunder and do what was evil in the Lord's sight?" Saul insisted, "I did obey the Lord. I carried out the mission he gave. I brought back King Agag, but I destroyed everything else. And my troops brought the best of things, sheep, goats, and cattle, to plunder, to sacrifice to the Lord." But Samuel replied, "What is pleasing to the Lord, your offerings and sacrifices, or your obedience to his voice?" Oh, so when Saul gets caught, he tries to make an excuse, saying, "Well, I took all that stuff because I wanted to give it back to God. I wanted to give him a sacrifice. I was going to share. I wasn't going to keep it for myself." Instead of saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, I did wrong. Please forgive me. I disobeyed," he tried to make excuses. As we read more and more and more of 1 Samuel, including up until chapter 18, we see that Saul kind of continues that downward spiral. He doesn't tell God sorry and truly mean it. He makes excuses, and in fact, when God's consequence is that Saul will no longer be king and David will be chosen as the next king, Saul rejects that and lives out his life in jealousy and anger and trying to take matters into his own hands time and time again. So Saul is not a great example of an ordinary sinner to follow. He's somebody that doesn't turn back to God and doesn't follow God's ways. We see in 1 Samuel 18, starting at verse 5, whatever Saul asked David to do, David did it successfully. Saul made him commander over the men of war and appointed an appointment that was welcomed by the people of Saul's officers. When the victorious Israel army returned home after David had killed the Philistines, the town of Israel came out to meet him. They sang and danced for joy. Saul has killed thousands, but David tens of thousands. This made Saul angry. He said, "They credit David with tens of thousands. Next, they'll be making him their king." So from that time on, Saul was jealous and kept an eye on David. The next day, a tormenting spirit overwhelmed Saul, and he began to rave like a madman. David was playing a harp, as he did each day. But Saul had a spear in his hand and hurled it at David, intending to pin him to the wall. But David escaped. Saul was afraid of David, for the Lord was with David and had turned away from Saul. We see that ultimately Saul rejected God so much that God wasn't even with him. God wasn't honoring him, wasn't giving him the place of a king, and wasn't helping him. He'd already moved on to appointing David. We see that Saul wasn't sorry, and that caused a lot of problems for both him and for David and for the nation of Israel. He was an ordinary sinner that made one of the biggest mistakes that you can make, and that's not just disobeying God, but rejecting God and not being repentant or being sorry when he made a mistake. Next week, we're going to talk about King David, and we're going to see the difference between David and Saul. David made some pretty big mistakes. He wasn't perfect either. He was an ordinary sinner. but the way he handled his mistakes and his sins was very, very different. So when we look at David next week, we'd encourage you to tune in again next week, July 18th, and see our message about King David and that ordinary sinner. So today there are some great activities to try at home. There's a green-eyed jealousy monster activity to try. There's a special ingredient challenge to take a look at making things and whether things are good depending on what ingredients you put in, good ingredients or bad ingredients. And our teens are also going to be talking a little bit about the nation of Israel and then Saul's downfall, and looking at how when we follow God's ways, things can work out, and when we try to take matters into our own hands, how that can sometimes lead us down a dangerous path, and kind of looking at that. So take a look at these various passages this week, talk about the discussion questions, and try some of the activities, and we will see you next week, July 18th, for another Ordinary Sinner. Bye, friends.